Hold on. So you're telling me that this video is going to be a discussion of some of the weird and confusing choices that Paizo made with their approach to skill checks in Pathfinder 2e, and we barely mention crafting in this script? That seems like a pretty serious thing to overlook. Today we're going to talk about the weird relationship I have with Pathfinder 2e's approach to skill checks on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that wants to know why Paizo didn't give the Intimidating Glare skill feat as a bonus for the teacher background. Educators, if you know, you know. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to probably one of the stranger videos I'm going to do on this channel. Today, I want to talk about Paizo's approach to how it manages skills and skill checks in Pathfinder 2e. And I'll go ahead and tell you that this video is a little bit weird for me to make because this is a section of the Pathfinder 2e rule set where my emotions pull in two very different directions. In some ways, I really love Pathfinder 2e's approach to skills, and in other ways, I find myself deeply frustrated by the choices that Paizo made, and I end up in a situation where I don't know what I think about Paizo's choice in how to manage skills. The best allegory I can come up with to Paizo's approach to skills, it's like looking at a piece of art that was done by my favorite artist, and that is clearly an expression of all of the technical skill and style of that particular artist, but the painting is done entirely in colors that I hate. That's literally what I feel like I am reacting to. And I think this video is, in a way, just me trying to explore and examine my own thoughts on this topic, but I also think that this is a good opportunity to talk about game design in TTRPGs, because anytime you make a decision when designing a game, those decisions are going to impact the play experience that people have, and every decision is naturally going to have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. There are always consequences to the choices that you make, and the weird space that I find myself in when I consider Pathfinder 2e's skill system is one of those areas where it really makes me think about game design and about the consequences of game design for players. So I would like to invite you to join me on a journey of self-discovery as I try to unpack what it is I both like and loathe about Pathfinder 2e's skill system, and maybe examine what we can learn about good skill systems along the way. But before we do all of that, I would like to do a shout out to the sponsor for this channel this month, who is Joshua Birdsong, also known in the Pathfinder 2e sphere by the name Improphet, and the Kickstarter that is currently live for Improphet's Tome. Over the last year, Improphet has been putting content out to the Pathfinder 2e community, different rules, options, and ideas that people can use in their home games. He's been taking feedback from the community, and now he's taking this content that he has developed and refined, and he has put together a Kickstarter to help bring a full book of character options out to the Pathfinder 2e community. Improphet's Tome will have over 40 new spells, 100 new items, 200 new class feats, and 100 other new character options for use in Pathfinder 2e. Additionally, Improphet's Tome will feature Improphet's take on the Warlock class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The content for this book has already been refined and pulled together, and Improphet is just raising the money to help make the book as nice as it can be, and hopefully include some pretty awesome artwork to go along with his creations. Third-party content is a healthy part of a good gaming community, and I think that Improphet is bringing together some fantastic work, so I encourage you to follow the link in the video description, go over to the Kickstarter, support Improphet's Tome, and help make this book a reality. Now that is the stuff that Joshua asked me to say about his book, but if you've seen some of my other ads for him, you already know that there's a little bit more I'd like to say. One of the best things about Pathfinder 2e is that Paizo publicly playtest the majority of the material that they put out to the community, and I think that that public playtest and feedback process is part of the reason that Pathfinder 2e is such a fantastic game. Well, Improphet also made his content available to the public and accepted feedback from people all around the Pathfinder 2e community before bringing together this final product, which means, in a way, Improphet has playtested his content before making it available to you and I, and that makes me respect Joshua as a content creator. Seriously, taking extra steps like that takes dedication, it takes hard work, it takes time, but I respect Joshua for doing it, so I genuinely want to see this Kickstarter succeed, and I encourage you to get out there and support him as well. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. I guess I should start this conversation with just a little bit of my personal perspective and why this conversation has been rattling around in my head as long as it has, to give you a little background on where this conversation started for me. A while back, I did a review on this channel of Paizo's other major game, which is Starfinder. And if you want a good example of how much this channel has grown, you can go back and check out that review here. But I remember when I was doing that review of Starfinder, one of the things that jumped out to me in that review was one of my initial impressions of the game Starfinder, which was how much I absolutely loved the skill system in Starfinder. At the time that Starfinder was published, it had what was, hands down, the best skill system I had ever seen in any RPG ever. Paizo made some decisions with how they managed skills in that game that I just instantly loved. It was like they wrote a skill system with me in mind. And to this day, anytime I think about Starfinder, that's one of the things that I remember incredibly fondly about that game. Now, at the time Pathfinder 2e was out, so I could make a comparison to Pathfinder 2e's skill system, and when I did, I began to notice that I didn't have the same positive emotional response to Pathfinder 2e's skill system that I had with Starfinder's skill system, and when I realized that, it began to bother me, because when I try to look at the two games objectively, I'm not sure which one actually has the better skill system. Like, when I look at Starfinder's skill system, if I'm being objective, there are some obvious issues with the skill system in Starfinder. There are some obvious areas where I feel like Paizo could have done a better job, and yet, when I think about Starfinder's skill system, my overwhelming emotional response is, yes, I love this. On the other hand, when I think about Pathfinder 2e's skill system, there are certainly some fantastic strengths to the system that I love and can appreciate. There are certainly some things that they did that I think constitute excellent game design, and yet, when I think about Pathfinder 2e, there is this emotional that comes with it. And that's such an interesting dichotomy for me. I can have one system that is clearly flawed, and yet overwhelmingly I love it, and then I can have another system that is probably comparable in overall quality, might even be objectively better. I'm sure there are plenty of people who would argue that point, and yet when I look at that system, it doesn't have near the positive reaction that the first one did. This is a weird space for me mentally, and I have spent a lot of time trying to break down in my mind what is it that Pathfinder 2e does, both positively and negatively, in its design for skill usage that causes me to have such conflicting emotions about this part of the game. Now, if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you know that I love Pathfinder 2e. It is, overall, my favorite TTRPG that has ever been published, and that's the reason it's the primary game I talk about on this channel. So when I'm talking about Pathfinder 2e, I am talking about a game that is starting from a pretty positive place in my mind, so why is it that this one part of the game gives me some hang-ups? So what I want to do today is I want to examine the skill system in Pathfinder 2e, talk about some of the negatives, talk about some of the positives, talk about how those different aspects of the game interact, and then talk about what we can learn about game design from the choices that Paizo made in Pathfinder 2e. And I do want to start with an interesting observation on the concept of a skills system, because D20 games in general, D&D, Pathfinder, Starfinder, have this weird distinction of skills as its own separate idea apart from other aspects of the game, most notably combat. And this is something that a lot of TTRPGs don't actually distinguish. If you think about it, most TTRPGs treat combat abilities as a subsection of your skills. Your skills are up here, and then your combat options fall underneath your skills, whereas in most D20 games, your combat options are over here, and then skills are this separate concept, and there may be some overlap between the two, but there's still a dividing line between them. As much as I love D20 games, this is actually one of the areas where D20 games are kind of weird in the gaming space. Most of us would argue that someone who can use a sword really well is skilled in the use of the sword. That is very natural language, very natural terminology, and so the idea that my weapon mastery is a skill that I possess is something that the majority of TTRPGs are naturally going to default to. But this is an area where most D20 systems tend to be a little bit different. They detach combat from at least the majority of skill rules, and combat often uses its own numbers, its own systems, its own mechanical concepts in order to execute that part of the game, and then you might bring in a skill or two here or there, but they are separate ideas. And there are certainly some positives from doing this, but it also can lead to a weird place where you have this completely separate set of language and terminology for combat versus skill usage. And this is going to come back up later in this video. Pathfinder 2e is notable in that it actually kind of pushes back against this divergence that has happened between combat and skills in D20 games historically. The TEML proficiency system in Pathfinder 2e applies both to combat options like the weapons that you use and to the skill proficiencies that you have inside the game, so you can actually see where D20 games once diverged combat and skill usage, and Pathfinder is bringing them back together. And I do think that is going to be an important note when we get into why I both like and dislike Pathfinder's approach to skills. But let's dive into some specifics and talk about both the negatives and the positives of skill design in Pathfinder 2e, and I want to start by talking about the negatives, about some of the different things that cause me to just have issues with skills in Pathfinder 2e, and I guess I'll go ahead and do at least a cursory acknowledgement of all of the conversations around crafting, because there is certainly a vocal community in and around the Pathfinder 2e sphere that would say that Pathfinder 2e crafting is problematic. There are apparently some alternate crafting rules coming because Paizo knows that it's not the best received part of the system, and I guess I can see the issues that people have. I'll go ahead and say that crafting in Pathfinder 2e, while it's not my favorite thing about the skill system, is not necessarily a portion of the system that just makes me angry. Crafting, as it currently exists inside of the game, seems to be less a way of adding to the power level of your character and more a way of adding to the variety of options available to your character, particularly when you get into higher level play. I don't want to chase every tiny detail here, but especially past about level 14 in Pathfinder 2e, that's where I think the crafting skills ability to open up the game of Pathfinder 2e starts to shine through a little bit more. Lower levels, I think it's less noticeable, but overall, crafting as a system is just kind of there for me. Which, compared to D&D 5e, is an improvement because at least the crafting system is there in Pathfinder 2e. Sorry. But overall, crafting is one of those things that I'm not very emotionally invested in, so I'm going to move on to other topics. When I consider some of the problems I have with the skill system in Pathfinder 2e, first off, there are a number of nitpicky things that I could go in and complain about. And a couple of things I could talk about here are skills that I feel that Pathfinder 2e should have included, or skills that I feel like Pathfinder 2e should have included in a slightly different fashion. First off, there are some, let's just go ahead and say, gaps in Pathfinder 2e's skill system. The most notable ones here for me are Insight and Investigate. These are two skills that you can actually take in D&D 5e, and while I definitely prefer Pathfinder 2e over D&D 5e when it comes to skills, I will say that I miss having Insight and Investigate as distinct skills in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Another skill that you would see in games like Call of Cthulhu that would be similar to Investigate would be a skill like Research or Library Use. That's another thing that I also think is kind of missing in Pathfinder 2e. Now, some of you may be responding to this already. Allow me to say, yes, I am aware that a lot of the things that Insight is used for in D&D 5e fall under Perception in Pathfinder 2e. I'm aware of that. I'm just not sure that I like those concepts being merged together. In older versions of the game, you would have Perception and Sense Motive, and I remember back in the Pathfinder 3.5 days trying to combine those two and ultimately feeling disappointed when I did, and that disappointment remains with Pathfinder 2e. I feel like noticing things in the environment and noticing things in another person's behavior are two skill options distinct enough that I prefer to see them separate. Also, I am aware that the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e does offer some subsystems to help reflect the idea of research and investigation. So it's not like investigation or research or library use. It's not like you can't do those things in Pathfinder 2e, but this is almost a case of, I wish that those things had been built into the game from the word go, rather than added on later. Longtime fans of this channel may know another skill that kind of occupies a similar category in my mind, the Drive or Pilot skill. Yes, the Game Mastery Guide does give us rules for driving or piloting different vehicles, and I am happy to have those rules in the game, but I wish those rules had been part of the game from the very beginning, rather than added on at a later date, because when a rule set gets added on, it always feels slightly out of place. Another area where I could get kind of nitpicky on the skill system in Pathfinder 2e is the way that certain skill concepts are grouped together. Now, every game struggles with this, and an easy one that I could probably have some fun with would be Nature and Survival in Pathfinder 2e. Why are these two different skills? Or at the very least, why are these two different skills and the druid only gets one of them? I mean, it's a little bit better than D&D 5e where animal handling is also a separate skill, but you kind of catch my point. Anytime a game is trying to divide up what skills should be separate and what skills should be lumped together, you're going to wind up in a situation where some skill groupings feel awkward. Nature and Survival is an easy example in Pathfinder 2e. I understand from a game design perspective why they've been split apart, though personally I honestly would have kept them together. At least in those instances, I can understand where Paizo is coming from. However, there's another set of skill groupings in Pathfinder 2e that end up feeling a little too shallow for me because of the way that they're grouped, and that is Deception, Diplomacy, and Intimidate. Me personally, if I was designing Pathfinder 2e's skill system, I think that social skills can be split roughly into 4 skills. One of them is the insight skill that I discussed earlier, and then the other 3 are deception, persuasion, and manipulation. Deception in Pathfinder 2e and games like D&D 5e work essentially the same way, and I think deception overall is a pretty well-defined skill for Pathfinder 2e. Diplomacy, as presented in Pathfinder 2e, is very functionally similar to persuasion in D&D 5e, and though the terminology is slightly different, I think all in all, diplomacy, persuasion, I think they are relatively equivalent to one another, but one of the skills in 2e and 5e both that I actually end up a little disappointed in is the intimidate skill. I would love to see intimidate actually broadened a bit to include the concept of manipulation. I want my words not just to scare my foes, but also potentially to do things like taunt my foes or cause my foes to make other unforced errors. Now, you could argue that my concept of manipulation and deception overlap just a little bit, but with any skill system, you do have some overlaps that are going to happen, and intimidation, for a long time through a lot of games, has felt like a skill that's just a little too narrow for my tastes. But all of those things are, for the most part, nitpicks for me, that I could honestly take care of with a simple house rule if I wanted to. There are other issues with Pathfinder 2e's skill system that go a little bit deeper for me, and here I want to start getting into some of the things that really hold me back from enjoying Pathfinder 2e's skills as much as I might otherwise. And here I want to talk about a couple of things. First off, the idea of locked skill usage, and then the second one is skill feats. Because both of these design choices run counter to one of my core philosophies as a storyteller. As a storyteller, I'm one of those people who has a philosophy of, okay, roll it. Generally speaking, I do not like the idea that your character just can't do something. Sure, it may be highly improbable that your character can do something, and it certainly may be very inadvisable for your character to try something, but as a general rule, I don't like any rule set that says, no, you can't do that. That's out of your reach, you can't try, don't even bother rolling, you fail. Now, I realize there is an opposite extreme of this conversation, where a person wants to attempt to roll a natural 20 so that they can successfully hang glide through a hurricane. That's not the kind of stuff I'm talking about here. As a general rule, if an action is perceivable for a player to do, I don't like a rule set that says, you can't do this. And locked skill usage, and generally speaking, what could be termed skill feats, are 2 examples of design decisions that lock players out of even trying to do something. So what are these? I'm going to start with locked skill usage because this is probably the more serious offender, and locked skill usage is essentially where you have a rule inside of the game that says you can't even try, don't roll. A classic example of this, if you go back to older editions of Dungeons & Dragons, was the idea that only the rogue class could find traps. It didn't matter how long you had been adventuring, it didn't matter how skilled you were, if you weren't a rogue or a spellcaster using a narrow set of spells, you just couldn't find traps. That tripwire in the hallway right there? Too bad. And that was something I always despised in older games. The idea that every party had to have a rogue because otherwise you were just going to hit every single trap going down the hallway. I hated that. It seemed stupid. It broke my immersion in the game. And having played through games like that, anytime I encounter a rule in a game that just says, you don't get to roll, you can't do this, it frustrates me. Now, I will admit here, Paizo uses softer restrictions with their locked skill usage than a lot of other games use, so it doesn't bother me as much. For example, in Pathfinder 2e, oftentimes your character must be trained or maybe an expert in thievery in order to find a particular trap. And then certain traps can be found with skills like survival because that skill would actually be appropriate to the trap in question. And so for Pathfinder 2e, a lot of the locked skills are soft locks, and it's relatively easy for players to get around those locks. So it's not as problematic for me as older versions of the game might be, but just as a general rule, the idea that there are some locks you have to deal with does cause me some hesitation when it comes to Pathfinder 2e. Just including that as a concept is always going to be one of those things where I'm like, generally speaking, if a player could have a reasonable chance of trying to do something, I prefer a rule system where I as a game master can say, okay, roll it. Maybe the dice rolls well and they succeed. They may not have a high chance of winning, and there is certainly the danger of failure if they choose to roll, but I like to give my players the opportunity. Underneath locked skill usage, there is another concept that I have seen a few different times in D20 games that can loosely be termed skill feats, and I also have some issues here. Now in Pathfinder 2e, when we say skill feats, it is an explicit, carefully defined chunk of the rules that Paizo very clearly delineates from other options inside of the game. And I'll go ahead and say that that clear delineation is actually probably a good thing for this conversation, but we're not there yet. Skill feats as a concept, though, have been a bit broader in their usage in other D20 games. The idea generally is this: a skill feat is an option that a character can take to do something with their skills that they normally couldn't do. And if you were paying attention to my concept on locked skill usage, you understand why I don't like the idea of skill feats just as a general rule. My question, the vast majority of time I see anything in this category is, why couldn't my character already do that? Or at least, why couldn't they try? And I feel like I need to specify something here. I can understand a lock on skill usage if your character is not trained in a skill. If my character is not trained in Arcana, I probably don't have any hope of identifying a fireball, at least prior to the explosion. That sort of lock doesn't necessarily bother me. But if my character is trained in a skill, if I do know what I'm doing, at least to an extent, why should there be a portion of a particular skill that I just can't use? That truly just kind of makes me mad when I see that in a game. Oh, you know how to use stealth, but not this type of stealth? Why? I understand what game designers are doing when they include skill feats or skill feat-like options in a game. They're trying to diversify what players can do, but the default assumption for me as a storyteller is a diverse set of options of what players can do. Unless there is a specific reason why a character shouldn't be able to do something, I default to, well, they can at least try. If it's something that they can struggle with, I can make the roll hard, but there shouldn't be anything that prevents them from even doing it in the first place. A skill feat system added to a game just kind of feels like it is reminding me of all of those locks I already didn't want to see. Now, to Paizo's credit here, the skill feat system in Pathfinder 2e is not universally terrible. When we get to the positives, I will talk about some of the stuff that I think they did well here. But I do feel like I can note, not all of the skill feats in Pathfinder 2e are necessarily in this category of just unnecessary feat tax for me to be able to use my skills. A good example of a skill feat, an area where I think Paizo actually makes the skill system better, is with the dubious knowledge skill feat. This is a skill feat where when your character fails a recall knowledge check, you get two pieces of information. One is true, one is false, and you're not sure which is which. And I like that idea of a player rolling a knowledge check and being like, oh, it could be this or it could be this, and I'm not sure which one it is. Guys, what should we do? That, to me, makes skills more interesting. And if Paizo were publishing a lot of skill feats like dubious knowledge, that would be something I would truly enjoy inside of the game. That being said, a lot of skill feats are more akin to the impressive performance skill feat, which specifically allows you to use your performance skill to make an impression when meeting new people. And when I hear that, I ask, why couldn't I do that already? There is no reason, in my mind, that diplomacy should be the only skill that can make an impression unless you have a skill feat that says otherwise. I actually remember in the old Oriental Adventures books that they had a skill specifically for events like hosting a tea ceremony, and it talked about in those books how you could use the tea ceremony skill, which was essentially a crafting skill, as a way to make an introduction to new people in high society. Years and years and years ago in D&D 3rd Edition, there was an acknowledgement that skills outside of diplomacy could be used to make a favorable impression on people if a player had the right combination of skills and the right creativity to do so. And there have been plenty of times through the years that I have played a character with performance who has used his performance skill to ingratiate myself to a group. The impressive performance skill feat just feels like it is unnecessarily highlighting a lock on skill use that I don't even want in the game. So, as a general rule, when it comes to things like locked skill usage or skill feats, whether the formal definition in 2e or some of the other ways they get used in other games, anytime I see something like this in a skill system, it automatically just kind of puts a cap on how much I'm going to enjoy that skill system. It's kind of a, you can only go so far with me because you're putting something into a game that is inherently frustrating for me. However, that's not the only issue I have with Pathfinder 2e and its approach to skills, because locked skills, skill feats, those set what I would almost consider unnecessary boundaries for skill use in a game. There's another issue that is more of a core issue that really runs to the heart of being able to enjoy an RPG, which is knowledge skills versus active skills. Now, this is something that I actually encountered several years ago when I was playing Shadowrun, and I'm grateful to Shadowrun because it brought this to my attention. I had seen this in other games, but it just never clicked with me before I was creating a character in Shadowrun, and in the character creation of that particular edition, I think it was 3rd edition of Shadowrun, I could be wrong, but when you were creating your Shadowrunner, you got a pool of skill points specifically for active skills, and then you had a completely separate pool of skill points that went to knowledge skills. And in their discussion of active skills versus knowledge skills, they specifically said active skills are the things that you are regularly going to use inside of a game in order to gain a benefit or to gain advantage over your enemy. Active skills let you do something. Knowledge skills let you know something. And in that edition of Shadowrun, knowledge skills, they actually went so far as to say, we want these to be flavor for your character. Take a knowledge skill involving your favorite restaurants or orc heavy metal bands. The knowledge skills were seen as a way for your character to have some fun and flavorful stuff that they were familiar with, but the knowledge skills, Shadowrun basically came out and said, you're not going to get a lot of benefit from using these. And that made me wake up and realize, wait a minute, in an RPG there are going to be skills that will give you active benefits and advantages, and then there are going to be skills that let you know stuff. It doesn't change what you can do, it doesn't change what your character is capable of, it turns your character into a lore dump. That's it. And when Shadowrun opened my eyes to that concept, it changed the way I looked at skills in RPGs, because suddenly I was aware certain skills let you do things in the game and certain skills just turn you into a know-it-all. Fast forward to the publication of Starfinder, This is one of the big reasons I loved Starfinder so much. All of the skills in Starfinder are active skills. Seriously, go look it up. Go read that game. They don't use the terminology active skills versus knowledge skills, but when they designed the skill system for Starfinder, they made a game where every single skill in that game has some kind of active use inside of the game. Now, there are certain skills in Starfinder that can clearly be knowledge skills as well. They can let your character know something. Good examples of that would be engineering, life sciences, and mysticism. All three of those skills in Starfinder would generally be considered knowledge skills to at least a certain degree, and yet if you research all three of those skills, you will discover all three of those skills have active uses in Starfinder. Life sciences can be used for your character to mix pharmaceuticals and make new medicines. Engineering can be used to identify weak points in structures, to arm and disarm explosives, and can be used to repair objects. And then even mysticism, which could clearly be considered the most knowledge skill in Starfinder, is explicitly used as the skill if you're trying to disarm a magical trap. Every skill in Starfinder is an active skill. If you invest in a skill in Starfinder, there is some use for that skill in the game beyond just knowing stuff. And that's one of the things that I consider to be a big step backwards with Pathfinder 2e, is in Pathfinder 2e, there's some skills that seem very heavily demoted back to mostly knowledge skill level. Compare mysticism in Starfinder to religion in Pathfinder 2e, and you will discover that religion in Pathfinder 2e doesn't do nearly as much as it does in Starfinder. They didn't find as many active uses. Like, imagine if you could use the religion skill in Pathfinder 2e to disarm magical traps. That would be cool. And hey, there's some evil altars over there. We need to figure out how to shut that thing down. That would actually be a logical use. Now, don't get me wrong, Paizo has done some stuff to expand different skills inside the game. Lost Omens, Gods and Magic has some options for religion skill use that I think are interesting, but as a general rule, when you look at what mysticism can do in one system that Paizo wrote, it raises the question, why is the religion skill, which is roughly equivalent, far less effective in this other game that Paizo wrote later? It's like Paizo stumbled onto some really good principles of game design for Starfinder and forgot some of them with Pathfinder. And I know I've been using the religion example pretty heavily for the last couple of minutes, but there are other skills in Pathfinder 2e that are similar for me. Society feels very restricted, Arcana feels very restricted, and even the nature skill kind of feels more restricted than it needs to be in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. One of my big struggles with Pathfinder 2e's approach to skills is there are many times inside of the game that I wish the skills my character took had more active uses in play. And I do want to make a quick note here. Yes, skill feats can address this to an extent. Like I said a moment ago, Lost Omens, Gods and Magic gave us some skill feats like Battle Prayer and Blessed Tonic, where characters can gain new uses for the religion skill. So skill feats can help address this to an extent, but bear in mind, anytime you add a skill feat to Pathfinder 2e, at least for me personally, you go back to that whole locked skill usage problem that I have. It just kind of makes me ask the question, why couldn't my character do this to begin with? But that's a summary of some of the things I struggle with in Pathfinder 2e's skill system. Let's move over to some of the positives and talk about some of the good things that Paizo does. And I want to start by talking about the incredibly healthy structure of the skill system, the TEML proficiency system that Pathfinder 2e uses. I think that the TEML proficiency system is the most important, well-designed aspect of this game. Seriously, I think the TEML proficiency system is more important than the 3-action economy, it's more important than the class design. I really think when you cut this game open and look at it from a designer perspective, TEML proficiency is the unsung hero of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And since skills in Pathfinder 2e use the TEML proficiency, that means that the skill system in Pathfinder 2e is built on what I would call very good bones. It is a system that is very well integrated into the game, extremely reliable, and very meaningful to players, and when you take all these things together, that puts the baseline of the Pathfinder 2e skill system in a very good place. Let's talk about this. First up, well integrated. TEML proficiency, trained, expert, master, and legendary, is terminology you can find all over Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It applies to your armor, it applies to your weapons, it applies to your saving throws, to your perception, and it applies to your skills. You see this terminology everywhere. It's consistent. It means the same thing everywhere you go. Trained means your level +2, expert level +4, on and on. No matter where you see this terminology on your character sheet, you immediately know what it means, and that means that TEML is very well integrated, but it also means anything using TEML is well integrated with the rest of your character sheet. Because that terminology is consistent from attacks to armor class to skill usage, that means that skill usage is going to naturally translate well when it's interacting with other parts of the rules. This is something that I mentioned earlier, where Pathfinder 2e is actually pushing back against a long-standing aspect of D20 game design. In other versions of D20, combat rules kind of go this way, skill rules kind of go this way, and there's a little bit of overlap in the middle, but they don't necessarily merge. Pathfinder 2e is different. Because of TEML proficiency, the skill system can pop right into combat, and it's going to make sense, it's going to function. Players and game masters immediately know what it means, how it's used. It is integrated well. And when you have something that is integrated well, that means that it is also reliable. You expect your skills to work, right? Well, because Paizo has this healthy, understandable, very clear formula to what TEML means, that means if you have a skill at a particular level of proficiency, it's going to reliably function where you intend for it to function. Sure, this is a game. Variance in dice rolls is something that happens. You can be legendary in stealth and botch your stealth roll. Happens to the best of us. But generally speaking, because of how the math of the game is designed, your skills are going to reliably function how you want them to function. If I say that my character is a master craftsman, that translates to the game. I'm going to be able to do master craftsman level stuff with some reasonable reliability, and I think that's important. If I say that my character is an expert swordsman, I expect my character to have a pretty good chance of hitting something with a sword, right? Well, if I say that my character is an expert athlete, I also expect them to be reliable in a wrestling match or in a foot race, correct? Well, in Pathfinder 2e, skills are reliable, that's a good thing. And last but not least, trained, expert, master, and legendary are all examples of meaningful terminology. In other words, when I say that my character is trained in stealth, that means something before I ever tell you what the number is, right? By the same token, if my character is a legendary acrobat, even if you don't know what the number on my character sheet is, you have an idea of what that means inside the game. And again, this is terminology that translates everywhere. If my character has legendary fortitude saves, you might not know their number, but you know that poison probably won't work on them. If my character has a master level will save, you can reasonably expect that they will probably not fall victim to most mental attacks. Well, that's true with skill usage as well. Just the terminology that Paizo uses, trained, expert, master, and legendary, and to be honest, the untrained designation as well, all of those terms are meaningful in a way that when a player hears them, they instantly have an idea of what to expect before you translate out the number on the character sheet. And this is one of the reasons I've said in other videos that Pathfinder 2e is so easy to teach. I have seen brand new players latch on to, oh, your character is trained in simple weapons, and when I said that word trained, they look down at the formula on the character sheet and immediately figure out what their number is. Paizo's terminology is meaningful in a way that is going to engage players, and so TEML, taken as a whole, represents very good bones for Pathfinder to build its skill system off of. And that to me says that at least the basis of Pathfinder 2e skills is very reliable, it's a very solid thing. So then you start to ask the question, okay, how do you take this solid framework and execute the skill system for good or bad design purposes? And I don't want to leave the impression here that Paizo took a fantastic basis and then did nothing but make execution errors, because I do think that Paizo does several things right in how they execute the skill system. There are several moments, there are several places where I do feel like Paizo has done a good job in how they chose to execute their skill design. One of them I actually mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking about the negatives, which is the idea of soft restrictions. Now, I am not a fan of locked skill usage. I am always going to bristle anytime there is a lock on skill usage in any game. But I can see the justification for at least some locks on skill usage, and if you're going to have a lock on skill usage, then I think the way to do it is with what I would call soft restrictions. And I will say I think Paizo, for the most part, delivers on soft restrictions for most of their skill locks in this game. What do I mean? Well, most skill feats in Pathfinder 2e aren't hard to get. The vast majority of skill feats in Pathfinder 2e, all you have to do is be high enough level and have invested enough in the particular skill to take that skill feat, which, if you want to take the skill feat, those are things that are going to happen naturally. If I want to take a 7th level stealth skill feat, then it is very plausible that I will have invested a couple of proficiency bumps into stealth just in the course of leveling up anyways. Most of the skill feats in this game have no prerequisites, and the skill feats that do have prerequisites often don't have very many. I think the worst that I have seen in this game is a 15th level skill feat with 2 other skill feat prerequisites, and given that every character in this game has at least 10 skill feats available to them, that's not a huge feat tax for what would be very major payoff abilities. There are other skill feats that do have some additional restrictions on them. A good example would be some of the skill feats that hide behind certain archetypes, but even there you're looking at an archetype dedication and a high enough character level, and maybe one other skill feat that you have to get beforehand. Again, that's not hard to do. So I will say this, Paizo has done a good job in being deliberate in the restrictions that they place, that the vast majority of skill feats and other locks inside of the game still remain reasonably accessible, and this is important to any character that would want to take them. The idea that only a rogue can find and disable traps bothers me. The idea that any class could invest in thievery or other skills in order to find hazards, that's what I want to see, and sure, you can give rogues some extra advantages in that category, but I like the idea that any character has the freedom and flexibility that if they want to get around a particular skill lock, it's not going to be too hard for them to do. That's very important, and I think that is a good design decision by Paizo. It feels like when Paizo was developing their skill system, they wanted to leave it as open as possible so that any character could reasonably go in any direction if they were interested in doing so. And a good example of this is perception's not a skill. This is actually one of the funniest things about teaching Pathfinder 2e. I've heard this question more than almost any other question from experienced gamers when they learn Pathfinder 2e for the first time. They'll go through and start picking their skills, and they'll get done picking their skills, and they'll be like, wait, I forgot, where's perception? One of the things that Paizo did is it actually separated perception out and made it its own unique stat inside of the game that every class automatically invests in to a different degree. Now, I won't say that Pathfinder 2e perception is perfect. I could nitpick it if I wanted to, but I will say this, in a lot of TTRPGs, perception feels mandatory. You have to take it or something bad's going to happen to your character. And I've seen a lot of players who don't want to take perception but feel like they have to take perception, and in so doing skip out on options that their characters want. So in Pathfinder 2e, Paizo just deliberately said, perception is not one of your skill picks. Every class gets it, it's taken care of, here's a general feat in case you want to push it a little bit higher, but perception is not going to be a tax on your character's skill progression. That is good game design, and it's emblematic of what Paizo has done as a whole in Pathfinder 2e. It has created a game where it feels like you have, I'm just going to use the phrase, more than enough room for whatever you want to do. You have plenty of skill bumps. You have plenty of skill feat picks. You have room to take what you want to take with your character. In fact, before we go any farther, I want to stop and ask you a question about Pathfinder 2e versus D&D 5e. Which system has more base skills? Alright, do you have your answer? The answer is D&D 5e. And I'll go ahead and tell you, I was shocked when I realized it. I've played D&D 5e several times, and I've obviously played Pathfinder 2e extensively, and I just kind of had this idea in my head that D&D 5e didn't have as many skills as Pathfinder does. Pathfinder felt like a more robust skill system. Now, if you want to get really technical, the way Pathfinder uses the lore skill, you could argue Pathfinder has more, but as a baseline, D&D 5e has 18 skills, Pathfinder 2e has 17 skills. And part of the reason that I bring this up is, over the course of my time playing both of these games, I have noticed when I play Pathfinder 2e, frequently I have room for extra skill choices beyond what I feel is core to my character's identity. Meanwhile, in D&D 5e, I've had several experiences where I have been frustrated because I felt like the character that I was developing couldn't be reflected on the page because of the restrictions on the skill system. Several years ago, I was playing a gnome illusionist in D&D 5e, and I really love the way illusion is handled in D&D 5e, just as an aside, so I really enjoyed that character, but part of that character's story that I had developed was a redemption arc that I wanted that character to go on, and as part of that, the character was going to be exploring different deities inside the setting and essentially exploring the idea of forgiveness. And so the religion skill was an important skill that my character would have wanted to have, but I didn't have enough skill picks to actually give that gnome illusionist the religion skill, meaning that I was playing a character that ultimately lacked something that I thought was important to the character. And that has happened several times with D&D 5e. I've gone to create a character and I have found myself wishing that I just had one or two extra skill picks because of what I felt was appropriate to the character. In Pathfinder 2e, I can honestly say the experience has been the exact opposite. Frequently, when I'm doing theory crafting for different builds in Pathfinder 2e, I find myself in a situation where I'm almost like, I don't know what I want to do with 2 or 3 of these skill picks. I've got all of the stuff I want for this character. Sure, they have medicine and crafting. Why not? One of the things that Paizo has done is they have been very deliberate in Pathfinder 2e about giving you plenty of skill bumps. They've been very good about giving you plenty of skill feats, especially if you're a rogue. They give you more than ample opportunity that if you want to invest in options inside of the game, you can do so. In fact, I'll go ahead and say this. There are really only 3 classes in Pathfinder 2e where I have ever felt like I was struggling to properly flesh out a character, and that's been Cleric, Druid, and Champion. Those 3 classes, I feel, tend to struggle a little in the skill department, but even with those classes, I've never found the level of frustration that I've experienced several times trying to select skills in D&D 5e. Usually in Pathfinder 2e, if I do feel like a character is slightly behind on skill progression, I can use a first level ancestry feat to pad out my skills a bit, and I end up exactly where I want to be anyways. So at the end of the day, one of the good game design decisions that Paizo makes is they are deliberate about saying, we are going to give you plenty of opportunity that your character can grow into any role, any option that they are interested in exploring. When you combine very soft restrictions and very liberal opportunity to invest in whatever a character might want to invest in, you create a game where you can really flesh out a character however you might want to, and it feels much more malleable, much more adaptable, and it's a very positive play experience. And that kind of summarizes the negatives and the positives of the Pathfinder 2e skill experience for me. There are elements on both sides of the scale that garner very strong reactions from me. Paizo did a very good job of building a good structure for the skill system, TEML, and they've done a fantastic job of giving you plenty of opportunity to invest in the skill system in meaningful ways, and the restrictions, the locks if you will, are relatively soft, meaning that pretty much any character can go pretty much any direction, allowing for a very versatile play experience, and these are, I think, fantastic game design choices. But at the same time, I can turn around and say that it does feel like Paizo has unnecessarily caged certain skill choices into the knowledge skill versus active skill dilemma that I discussed earlier, and just the idea of locks and skill feats in and of itself is a design choice that I am naturally hesitant about, and so when it comes to Pathfinder 2e, I find myself in this weird seesaw, both greatly enjoying certain aspects of it, and at the same time feeling very conflicted and hesitant. So I kind of wonder what your experience has been, and what do you think about the skill system in Pathfinder 2e? I would love to hear your thoughts. How do you think the Pathfinder 2e skill system stacks up to other skill systems in other games? Is there another game that has a better skill system, and what is it about that skill system that truly makes it appeal to you? Or do you think Pathfinder 2e comes out on top, and if so, why do you think that Pathfinder 2e deserves the crown? And I'm just curious to hear, does anyone experience a similar conflict like I have when it comes to this aspect of a game that I typically enjoy quite a bit? The time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you, and I would love your feedback on this topic. This video is a little bit of a break from the usual content that I do, but it's a conversation I've wanted to have for a while, so I am excited to hear what you all think about Pathfinder 2e and the choices that Paizo made and how it executes the skill system. Jump down to the comments section, leave your thoughts, leave your ideas. I am definitely going to be talking with you all because I want to know what you think. As always, don't forget the other YouTube stuff. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Both of those are linked in the video description down below. And before I get out of here, one last time, I just want to say, please go check out the Kickstarter for Improphet's Tome. I am excited for Joshua and the work that he is doing, so please give him your support. But as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.